Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 8 to chapter 4, verse 6 in our continuing study of the general epistles. We left off chapter 3, verse 8, where Peter sums up to all of you, he says, be harmonious, sympathetic, brotherly, kind-hearted, humble in spirit, not returning evil for evil, or insult for insult, but giving and notice that word, blessing instead. And the reason I circled it is because we're going to see the repetition. For you were called for this very purpose, that you might inherit a blessing. So be giving a blessing, and be all these things, but especially be giving a blessing, because you were called that you would inherit a blessing that you're to be passing it on. For the one who desires life, to love and see good days, must keep his tongue from evil and his lips from speaking deceit. Notice it's almost turned into a sort of a poetry, and it sounds like that because it has. He's quoting from Psalm chapter 34, verses 12 through 16. The one who desires life, to love and see good days, must keep his tongue from evil and his lips from speaking deceit. He must turn away from evil and do good. Let him seek peace and pursue it. For the eyes of the Lord are toward the righteous, and his ears attend to their prayer. But the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. And that's a quote from the Psalms. And it was true then, and it's still true, that you're called for a special kind of life. Peter goes on to say in verse 13, who is there to harm you if you prove zealous for what is good? You know, as when you're doing good to people, they're not usually out to hurt you. They like you doing good to them. Who is there to harm you if you prove zealous to do what's good? But even if you should suffer for the sake of righteousness, and you could, that's potential. But even if that happens, you're blessed. You are called for a blessing, and you are blessed in that. And do not fear their intimidation, and do not be troubled. This is, again, a quote from Isaiah chapter 8, verses 12 and 13, that says, you're not to fear what they fear or be in dread of it. It's the Lord of hosts whom you should regard as holy. You shouldn't be fearing. And he continues, do not be troubled, but rather, instead, sanctify Christ as Lord in your hearts. Now, notice we're not finished with the verse yet, but I ran out of room, so I want to slide it up. But sanctify Christ as Lord in your hearts, always being ready to make a defense of everyone who asks you to give an account for the hope that is in you, yet with gentleness and reverence. Notice there, to be ready to make a defense, that word apologian. From which we get our term apologetics. Now, it doesn't mean to apologize, but it means does mean to. That word defense is a good translation, to make a defense or to give a reason to everyone who asks you to give an account for the hope that is in you. We ought to be Christians who have reasons and who can defend our faith and have reasons for why we believe the way we do. We're called to that, and yet we're to do that, notice, with gentleness and reverence. We're not finished with the sentence. And keep a good conscience, so that in the thing in which you are slandered, those who revile your good behavior in Christ will be put to shame. That is, yes, you are to give a defense, but do it in such a way that not only your words give a defense, but your life gives a defense, as you set Christ apart as Lord in your heart, so that those who revile you, those who speak evil against you and your actions, will look at your actions and say, oh my, if that's a Christian, well, isn't that to be admired? Verse 17, for it is better, if God should will it so, that you should suffer for doing what is right than for doing what is wrong. Suffering can come, but don't be suffering just because you did something wrong, because you deserve it, but rather, if God should will it, and sometimes he will, it's better if you suffer as an innocent, as a good doer, than for being an evil doer. He goes on to give the example of Jesus. For Christ also died for sins, once for all, the just for the unjust, so that he might bring us to God, having been put to death in the flesh, but having been made alive in the Spirit, in which also, in that Spirit in which he, the same Spirit that made him alive, in which also he made and went proclamation to the spirits now in prison. Notice, he was made alive in the Spirit, and by that, in which he also went and made proclamation to the spirits now in prison. Now, when did this take place? Well, when did Christ die for sins? He died for sins when he went to the cross. He was put to death in the flesh. He was made alive in the Spirit. But notice, he went and made proclamation to the spirits, and our translators, they sort of insert the word, they're trying to explain it. The spirits in prison. The spirits in prison, let's just pick up where we left out because it's part of a run-on sentence. The spirits in prison who once were disobedient when the patience of God kept waiting in the days of Noah. Now wait a minute. When did Jesus go and make proclamation to those spirits in prison who were disobedient in the days of Noah? Well, when did he do that? Did he do it when he died and went to the grave? No, it doesn't say that. I would suggest instead he did it in the time element that's mentioned here. He did it in the days of Noah. That is, the same Spirit that raised him from the dead was the same Spirit that spoke through Noah to the people living in that day, a Spirit toward which they were disobedient when the patience of God kept waiting. You see, God said he was going to destroy the world with a flood, but he didn't do it immediately. He waited. In fact, if I read Genesis chapter 6, verse 3 correctly, he waited something like 120 years. In the days of Noah, during the construction of the ark, they have an expression that Rome wasn't built in a day. Well, the ark wasn't built in a day. And during that time, now, 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 10 already made reference to the Spirit of Christ. Talked about how the prophets made careful searches and inquiries. And the Spirit of Christ within them was indicating as he predicted the sufferings of Christ. We saw the Spirit of Christ there. Here we see that the Spirit of Christ was also there in his person, can I say it, in his prophet Noah. As Noah preached righteousness to the people of his day, a preaching to which they did not listen, as Noah was constructing the ark, as he was constructing the ark in which a few, that is, 8 persons, were brought safely through the water. Now that's going to become a symbol. The ark becomes a symbol. Here's the symbol corresponding that to which baptism now saves you. You see, they were saved in the ark. You are saved through baptism. Does baptism save you? Well, what it represents save you. Just like, the ark saved them, baptism now saves you. Not the removal of dirt from the flesh. In other words, it's not getting what that saves you, but what it represents, but an appeal to God for a good conscience through the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who is at the right hand of God, having gone into heaven after angels and authorities and powers had been subjected to him. Notice we had talked about subjection in the previous section, about how we're called to be subject because Jesus was subject, but now all those things have been subjected to him. Chapter 4, verse 1, therefore, since Christ has suffered in the flesh, and that's what we were talking about before, how he suffered in the flesh, since Christ has suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves also with the same purpose, because he who has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin. Once you've died, you don't have time to sin anymore. You're dead. And our identity with Christ is such that if we have died in him, in our identity, in who we are considered dead in Christ, and that means we are considered without sin now in Christ because we've ceased from sin. So as to live the rest of the time in the flesh no longer, even though I'm technically, physically in the flesh, but I should be living my life not like I'm just here, not just taking up this body, but I am living a new kind of life, a new kind of resurrection life, a life that is to be esteemed as though that old person had died and this new person had come, so that I live no longer in the flesh for the lust of men, but now I live for a different purpose. I live for the will of God. And that's the outworking of my spiritual identity. Peter goes on to say, verse 3, for the time already for the time already past is sufficient for you to have carried out the desire of the Gentiles. You lived that way before, but no longer, having pursued a course of sensuality and lust and drunkenness, carousings, drinking parties, and abominable idolatries. That's the way you used to live. That was status quo for the Gentiles, but you don't live there anymore. In all this, they are surprised that you don't run with them into the same excess of dissipation, and they malign you. They say, "What's wrong with you? You're no fun anymore." But they will give account to Him who's ready to judge the living and the dead. You're not there anymore, and so you have moved from death to life. But they're still living in death, and they will give an account to the one who judges both the living and the dead. Continuing with that same idea, the living and the dead, for the gospel has for this purpose been preached even to those who are dead. It's not talking about physically dead, spiritually dead. It has been preached to those who are dead, in order that though they are judged in the flesh as men, they may live in the spirit according to the will of God. Have you come to life? Have you come to spiritual life? Have you come to that place where you can live according to the will of God? That way is through His Son, Jesus Christ.